What's up, guys, and welcome back to Bass Fishing Tips. In today's video, in today's bass fishing tip, I want to talk about why fishing for things other than bass can help us learn how to catch more and bigger bass. Now, this is a really interesting idea and a really interesting concept, and I think oftentimes when I talk about this with other anglers, they kind of look at me strange when I begin, and by the end they're going, it's actually a pretty good idea. And so, I kind of started to flesh this idea out a couple years ago. And the reason I did that is because I actually got into some trout fishing. I wanted to go try to catch a trout. It was a species that I had never targeted. And lucky for me, here where I live in Tennessee, we're surrounded by some of the best trout fishing waters in the nation. We've got a lot of great opportunities to go catch trout. And so I got really deep into studying, where trout live, why they live there, what they're eating, started following the stocking reports, and started trying to target some trout, and ended up having quite a bit of success targeting trout, catching some big trout, and having a ton of fun. Now, one of the things I started to notice, though, is as I was looking for these trout and studying about where trout live, why they live there, and what they're eating, and then I would show up to these places and actually start fishing for these trout and targeting these trout, I would be amazed by how many big bass I would see living in the same areas that these trout were living, in these same areas that these trout were being stocked, and even more so, how these fish would show up certain times a year and in certain water conditions that the trout seemed to enjoy a lot. These bass would show up and they would enjoy that the trout were there because those bass were actually eating some of those small fingerling and small kind of hand-sized stock trout that were being put in some of these bodies of water. And so what I started to learn is that by targeting another species, and specifically targeting a species that bass like to eat, I was able to find new areas to go and fish and new ways to target big bass that many other people may not be targeting. Great example of this is last year, I almost broke the state record spotted bass for Tennessee. I was a half pound off, and I was fishing in an area that was stocked with trout. And the reason that these big bass were in this area is because they were actually eating those trout that were being stocked. And the reason that I know this is because when I hooked that fish, it actually ended up spitting up a stalker trout. And so these fish, these big bass, were moving into this area, specifically living in this area and swimming up into this area so that they could try to eat those trout. And now I think this can be applied everywhere and in any situation. I mean, even as kids and even now, it's fun to go catch bluegill, right? You get a bucket full of crickets or a little jar full of worms, and you go out and you fish with bobbers for bluegills and panfish and shell crackers and all the different kinds of panfish species there are out there. But what you'll notice is oftentimes anywhere that you're fishing for bluegills, there are going to be big bass not too far behind them and not too far from them because big bass like bluegills. Crappie is another great example. I can't tell you how many times that I've caught big fish and or witnessed big fish being caught that when you look down their throat, you can see the tail of a crappie sticking out. So if we know where the crappie live and how to catch those crappie in all the areas that crappie like to live around, by just extension and by proxy, we're going to know where the big bass are living as well. And so it's something for us as bass anglers to keep in mind that fishing for things other than bass can help us to catch bigger and more bass because we figure out new areas that those bass like to live in, new forage and a type of forage, maybe like with the trout, that you didn't even realize the bass were eating. Another thing that it helps you do is helps you to target bass in a brand new way that you may have never targeted them before. So I went down to Georgia a couple weeks back for Shoaly-Palooza. It's a Kayak Adventure Series tournament to fish for shoal bass. Now, shoal bass are a really wildly kind of different black bass species, but they have some similarities more kind of to smallmouth and spots than they do to actually largemouth. And the thing with a shoal bass is they live in shoals. They live up in these shoals. They live in fast current. They live in eddies and backflow points and different things. And these bass often act a lot like trout do. And it took me a little while to kind of figure out where these bass were actually living, but once I figured out where they were living, I started to apply things that I learned from trout fishing and, actually fishing like, flow points and, like little riffles and make sure I'm throwing my bait up at the start of a wash and kind of letting that bait wash down naturally. I started to apply those things to fishing for those shoal bass and ended up catching more and bigger shoal bass because I was able to apply trout fishing techniques to shoal bass fishing. And I've done the same thing with river smallmouth and river fishing in general. I love to fish rivers. I love to fish current. And the more that I fish for very current driven fish like trout, I was able to apply some of those kind of fishing techniques and some of those, pretty much like fishing mechanics, we'll say, how to cast into an area, how to work a bait out of an area, how to use a riffle or a flow, and how to actually let a bait flow through those areas. I was able to start catching bass that I never would have caught before because I didn't understand kind of the dynamics of how baits interacted with, current and how they would play when they float into a certain area, or how even the bass were interacting with that, because trout are the same way. A trout wants to sit in a specific area, and so does a bass. And so when I started to be able to not only apply the mechanics of trout fishing and fishing current to bass fishing, but then figuring out the difference between where the bass want to live and where the trout want to live, I was able to put the whole puzzle together, and I was able to catch bigger bass in different places that other people, I think, that were targeting because of going after and kind of fishing for a specific species that I had never fished before. And so just keep that in mind. If you're looking for a new way to learn something new about bass fishing, go out there and fish for the things that bass like to eat. Things like trout, crappie, bluegill, go and fish for those species because it's going to help you to catch bigger bass in the long run. And if you guys want to see me fishing in an area that is full of trout, and it's an area that I actually went and kind of sought out to go catch some fish because I knew trout lived there, click this video. It's popping up right here.